It's a little daunting today because there's friends and relatives and people who knew Lucile. And so if I make any mistakes, you can just look around and somebody will be correcting me. When I meet people who knew Lucile or knew of her or remember her long-running history column that was in the, oh wait, sorry. There. Her long-running history column that was in the Springfield newspapers, they generally say something like, she was a real pioneer, wasn't she? After all, she began her newspaper career in Denver 101 years ago, and then she moved on to El Paso, and then came home to the Ozarks on her way to a job in London. So she was a pioneer of sorts. But as I did the research for the book, I learned that everything Lucile did, every job she held, every place she worked, there were other women there, and there were other women who had come before. And nobody ever told me that. So I want to tell you a little bit about that tonight. I was fortunate enough to get to know Lucile well when I was in my 20s, and I was working at Springfield newspapers, where she had been a reporter for almost 40 years. She was still writing that good old days history column. And I remember her coming into the newsroom in those pre-internet days with the column in her hand and to give it to managing editor Dale Freeman. Sometimes she would also bring another article, something that she thought the newspaper had missed. And she would tell Dale that he needed to run that article because it was important, and she'd hand it to him. And as far as I remember, Dale always ran those articles. Because even in her 80s, Lucile was a force to be reckoned with. And that's one of the reasons that her life was so intriguing. So, Lucile Morris was born in 1898, just 33 years after the end of the Civil War, in Dadeville, which was then a thriving farm town northwest of Springfield. She said she had a bookish family. It was also a storytelling family. She grew up, She grew up listening to tales about her mother's uncle who was killed in the Civil War Battle of Wilson's Creek, and stories about the Bald Knobbers, the vigilante group that terrorized the Ozarks in the 1880s right after the Civil War. And she heard stories about Daniel Boone's youngest son, Nathan, who she thought later was more important to Missouri than Daniel ever was. Nathan was a surveyor and salt producer near here, up in Boone's Lick. He was a peacemaker on the western frontier. He was a member of the first Missouri state legislature, and his big home was crumbling away over in a little town called Ash Grove, not too far from where she was growing up. And Lucile always said that those stories from her childhood were responsible for her lifelong interest in history and her passion for preserving historic sites. Now, she grew up in a little house on the corner of her Morris grandparents' big farm. And this is Lucile with her two younger brothers, and her mother. Her father died when she was 9, and she grew up knowing she was going to have to take care of herself as an adult. I planned to become a teacher, she told groups later. It was the only career I knew. And when she was 19, she did become a teacher in her own school that she'd grown up in. There, she fell in love with another teacher. His name was Homer Garland, and he told her his goal in life was to save his money and move west and become a newspaper reporter. They taught together for a year, and then Garland left for World War I. Fortunately, he didn't go overseas, and after the war ended, he found a job at the Tulsa Democrat as a reporter. He often came back to the Ozarks to visit Lucile, and he wrote her passionate letters from Tulsa about his great love for her, about being a reporter, and about the importance of newspapers in the world back in those days. And here's one of those letters. And Garland wrote, "Did you ever consider what would happen if we were without newspapers, even for a day? Businesses would be partially paralyzed, and the whole country would be as greatly upset as if there was no bread." Now, today that's a little hard to imagine, but people read the newspapers in those days not only to find out what was going on around the world, but to find out what was going on in the next county even, because they didn't travel very far. Other times, Garland wasn't quite so high-minded when he wrote his letters. Here's another one. "We're having it very dull right now insofar as big local news is concerned. A few deaths, conventions, minor accidents, and that sort of thing. But one of these days or nights, there'll be a suicide and a train wreck and a killing all at once. Then business will pick up. Odds are it was Garland and those letters that lighted the fire in Lucile for her own career. She saved the letters, and incidentally, they are available online through the Springfield Greene County Library, and also on microfilm at the State Historical Society in Columbia, and they're really interesting reading. But those letters weren't enough to keep Lucile interested in Garland. By 1922, the two had parted ways, and she was looking for an adventure. And she found it in, of all places, Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell was advertising for teachers from the East, and Lucile signed on, and she rode what was called the teacher train out west. Whenever I say that, I get this picture in my mind of the old Western movies, you know, when the stagecoach comes into town, and this very prim schoolmarm on the coach, and the handsome cowboy gets her off, and she falls in love, and they save the town. I don't think any of that happened to Lucile, but she did spend a year teaching in Roswell, mulling over her future. By the end of the spring term in her school, she had decided to change careers. She made up her mind to attend the new journalism school that had opened at the University of Missouri in 1906. And she may have even known that the first graduating class included a woman, Mary Beth Paxton, and that's the first graduating class there. So Lucile hitched a ride home from a friend who had an automobile, and on the way they took a side trip to Denver. In Denver, which was a big city, the friend went sightseeing, and Lucile decided to take a chance, and she applied for a job at the Denver Post. Well, the Post told her that they didn't have any openings right then, but the editor told her she might want to try the much smaller Denver Express across town. So Lucile found her way to the Express office, and she asked if they would hire her, even though she had no experience and had not been to journalism school. Well, the editor told her he would much rather train his own people, and they had an opening, and he hired her on the spot. So that was the beginning, and as I said earlier, it was 101 years ago, the summer of 1923. Now, Lucile began her career at the Denver Express as the lowest of the low, as far as newspaper jobs are concerned. She was a sob sister, and she wrote the advice to the Lovelorn column. So let me digress a little bit and tell you about sob sisters. In 1907, a wealthy New York playboy named Harry Thaw he murdered an architect named Sanford White to salvage the reputation of his chorus girl wife. Well, you can imagine. The trial that they held for Thaw was sensational and long-running, and it attracted reporters from all over the country, dozens of them, including 4 women, who pulled out all the stops in their emotional daily articles. Before the trial was over, those 4 women were making the news themselves with their heart-rending reports. Now, those tear-jerking, poignant articles earned them the name Sob Sisters, and that name grew to refer to any female reporter who wrote about emotional subjects in an emotional way. Think, widows and orphans. But also remember that a lot of social change came as a result of those articles. Anyway, one of the 4 of these original sob sisters, Dorothy Dix, and this is her on the left, had already penned the first newspaper advice column, and they were quickly copied all over the country. Another of the 4 was Winifred Black Bonfils. She was known as a girl stunt reporter, which is another name given to many of the early newspaper women. And Bonfils had made a name for herself shortly after the San Francisco earthquake, when she faked a fainting spell on the streets of San Francisco in order to write an expose about her treatment in the San Francisco Emergency Hospital. And she actually later worked for the Denver Post. Anyway, the assignment to author an Advice to the Lovelorn column and write weepy human interest stories was where many newspaper women started out in those days. At the Express, Lucile dispensed advice under the name of Cynthia Gray. She fielded questions from young women about whether to quit their jobs when they married, what to do about unfaithful husbands and boyfriends, and how to pick a career. As the year progressed, her answers became less conservative and her advice to the young women more pointed. She told them to become independent and make more decisions themselves, which probably reflected her own growing independence. But she wasn't Cynthia Gray every day. From the beginning, the newspaper sent her to cover real news stories, mostly small ones. But that's when she fell in love with being a newspaper reporter. Then, one Sunday morning, the editor looked around the newsroom and called her over. "President Harding is in town," he told her. "Go see, find out what's going on." Not a bad step up for a sob sister. The assignment to write about President and Mrs. Harding's visit to Denver remained the highlight of Lucile's career. As she said, "I never have, or before or since, felt so proud as I did that Sunday morning, with her newspaper credentials crossing the police lines to get to the president." Another major assignment she had in Denver had to do with women's rights. The National Women's Party came to Colorado to push for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which incidentally has yet to pass. Lucile interviewed Alice Paul, who is the founder of the party, and she's the lady on the left there. And she interviewed other women leaders. But the woman on the right in the hat, named Alva Belmont, she was a supporter of the movement, and Lucile said she had really difficulty interviewing Mrs. Belmont because she said, "Mrs. Belmont wanted to interview me. She kept asking if I was facing discrimination in my job." And Lucile said, "I was so deliriously happy being a newspaper reporter, I just couldn't even think about it. I couldn't complain about anything." Well, while she was at the Express, she also had a chance to meet other women reporters in town. One of them she met was Frances Wayne, there on the left, an investigative reporter with the Denver Post, who had also begun as a sob sister. Lucile described Mrs. Wayne as decidedly the big shot among newspaper women. "I began hearing stories about how she lorded it over all the other reporters." Then one day, I was sent to get an interview at the city jail. It was my first time to step inside a jail. I was to interview a woman forger, and it was my first time to talk to a woman criminal. Close to my first time to write a newspaper story of any importance. "Well," she said, "I went on into the cell with the woman forger, got my feeble interview, and I started back out to the jail office. And to my surprise, the matron introduced me to Frances Wayne." Now, perhaps Mrs. Wayne took pity on such an unsophisticated girl reporter. Or maybe she was just big-hearted. But anyway, she did many lovely things for me when I was in Denver. She and her friend Polly Pry, who was the Denver Post's first woman reporter in 1898, sponsored me in the Women's Press Club before I really had enough experience to merit membership. Well, her new friends and the press club and her periodic opportunities to cover news stories were not enough. After a year in Denver, Lucile was really tired of being Cynthia Gray and writing the Lovewood column. She found a full-time reporting job at the El Paso Times, quit the Denver Express, and moved south. "Those were the good old days," she said, when reporters could go from one paper to another without difficulty. That's how they moved up the ladder. As in Denver, the Times staff employed women journalists and had for more than a generation. And Lucile's history buff that she was ate up what she learned about them. One of the women was Peggy Hull, who had been at the Times 6 years before Lucile got there. During World War I, Hull had talked the Times editor into sending her, unaccredited, to France with the El Paso area troops. In France, because she was not an accredited reporter or war correspondent, she couldn't go to the front lines. Instead, she wrote what were called chatty little stories about the military men, life in an artillery training camp, and about Paris during the war. And those chatty little stories attracted attention across the U.S. And within a few months, Peggy Hull was a national celebrity. When she returned to El Paso, she was welcomed back by a big crowd and a band, but she didn't stay long. Within a few months, she had convinced her military contacts to help her become the country's first accredited woman war correspondent. And she accompanied the U.S. Army to Siberia and later reported from the Pacific during World War II. Meanwhile, at the Times, Lucile worked with men and women who had literally been reporters all over the U.S. and Europe, and were nearly all on their way someplace else, as she had said. Later, she would cheer as they were nominated for Pulitzer Prizes, taught at universities, wrote novels, and edited some of the biggest newspapers in the U.S. I looked up one of the men that she had worked with, whose name I had seen in the papers, and he ended up being editor of the Los Angeles Times, for one. Another fellow who had worked with the International News Service even helped her get a job in London. So Lucile quit the Times and headed home for one last visit to the Ozarks before moving to London. But once she got home, as happens in this part of the country, one thing led to another, and she just stayed in Missouri. First, she applied to the Kansas City Star and the Post-Dispatch. But both of those big city papers turned her down because she was a woman, in spite of her experience, and in spite of the fact that they had hired women before. I skipped it? There it is, sorry. One of the women that they had hired was named Marguerite Martin, whose family hailed from Springfield. And Martin had joined the Post-Dispatch around 1900 as a staff artist. And she was a talented artist, but as it turned out, equally talented in interviewing and writing about her subjects. A lot of her material was about feminism and suffrage. But eventually, her fame was so great that she interviewed U.S. senators, presidents, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, and then other people like Andrew Carnegie, William Jennings Bryan, and Sarah Bernhardt. And that's Sarah Bernhardt up at the top there. And from what I know of Lucile, I'm sure she was disappointed the Post and the Star had turned her down, but she certainly wasn't heartbroken. In 1926, there it is, she joined the Springfield Leader, the oldest newspaper in town. And for the next 40 years, she was probably Springfield's best-known newspaper woman. Although even in Springfield, she wasn't the first. There were several women at the paper before Lucile, and I recently came across the name of a woman who had worked at the Leader around 1900 and may or may not have been the first one. Her name was Elizabeth Hyatt Gregory, and she wasn't in Springfield long. She later worked at other newspapers and went on to become the first woman to seriously cover aviation. She was on hand to report for the New York Sun on some of the Wright brothers' early flights and to cover Glenn Curtiss in the beginning of the aviation industry. And in 1909, she went to the White House when President William Howard Taft gave awards to those aviation pioneers. Now, I don't think Lucile was ever invited to the White House, but she did break barriers when she became the first woman in Springfield to cover the courts, county government, the sheriff's office, and the jail. And she also did have a chance to write about aviation, but from the passenger side. In 1929, Lucile's editor sent her to ride with the Ford Air Tour, which was a 5,000-mile cross-country promotional air race. And Lucile rode in a 7-passenger plane in the race leg between St. Louis and Springfield. Coincidentally, her plane won that day's race, and there were 20,000 people cheering when they landed in Springfield. And she said her pilot was pleasant and friendly as we chatted before takeoff. His name, Wiley Post. He was one of the real aviation pioneers. Now this is, I think, a promotions man in the middle for the air race, and the woman on the left was the wife of another one of the pilots in the race. Excuse me. But just 3 years later, Lucile flew again, and this time it was part of a promotion for passenger air travel. The new Transcontinental and Western Airways asked her to fly Space Available from Springfield to New York and to write about the trip. On the way, she was bumped and had to spend the night in Cincinnati, and then she was delayed in Pittsburgh until 10 o'clock at night before the plane took off. And she loved that late night flight to New York. "Never have I seen such a show," she wrote in the paper. "Below, miles and acres and swarms of light. I gasped to realize that all this unreal, unbelievable experience that I was watching from the sky actually existed." Can you imagine? I mean, nobody she knew had ever been in an airplane. And by chance, on the day that Lucile was flying to New York, Amelia Earhart was also flying across the U.S. to set a new women's record for transcontinental flight. She made it in 19 hours. "Aviation is a woman's game as well as a man's," Earhart told a reporter. Lucile, of course, said the same thing about journalism. Now, some of Lucile's assignments, like the 2 airline flights, were just plain fun. Others were the stuff of thrillers, like those that came out of her much-loved courthouse run. She delighted in the drama and being in on the action of the courthouse, and she thoroughly enjoyed being the first woman in a man's world. And incidentally, I'm quoting Lucile because she left a lot of papers behind, and she gave a lot of speeches, and she typed them up and kept them in little notebooks. So if I say Lucile said, She wrote it down, and I'm assuming that she said it out loud later. So I just thought I should let you know that this really is her words. And she said, "I never will forget the expression on the face of the sheriff and his deputies when I first walked into that office. The sheriff's office was a favorite loafing place for men, and took them considerable time to get used to a woman popping in the office every once in a while. Well, eventually the sheriff accepted her, but the first weeks of her courthouse run, she made a misstep. As she told him, she was watching out the window as two deputies marched a half a dozen prisoners from the jail over to the courthouse where they had a dentist office for treatment. Just as they got to the front steps, one of the prisoners broke and ran, she said, and as he crossed the street, a deputy shot him. Well, Lucile's instincts were good, but her experience was limited. She rushed to a telephone and called the newsroom, and when the editor answered, she yelled into the phone, "I've just seen a man killed. Send a reporter." It took her a while to live that down. But a year later, she wasn't daunted at all when word came that the sheriff and 5 of those deputies had all been shot to death at a farm west of Springfield. What became known as the Young Brothers Massacre was the worst police killing in the 20th century, right up to 9/11. And it was, of course, a national story. And Lucile was in the midst of that coverage. Now, as I said earlier, Lucile wasn't the only woman reporter in Springfield. Here she is around the time of the Young Brothers Massacre, with her friend Dosha Carroll on the left and Beth Campbell on the right. Not long after this picture was taken, Campbell married and moved to Washington, D.C. And there she went to work for the Associated Press and covered press conferences at the White House that First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt held exclusively for women journalists. Carroll eventually went to Japan as an editor with the U.S. Army of Occupation, and then she spent the bulk of her career as an editor of Japan Airlines magazine. And Lucile also wrote letters to Dosha all of the rest of her life, and she kept copies of those letters. So also that was a source of Lucile's opinions on a whole lot of people and what was going on in her life. Well, Lucile stayed at the newspaper until 1936, and that year everything changed. She married Eugene Upton, a Greene County Circuit Court reporter, and obviously he's the man in the white suit. Upton was a widower with 2 sons in the military and a daughter in high school. And as was the custom in those days, Lucile quit the newspaper when she married, but she didn't stop working. During her time off, her long years of interviews and research about the vigilantes who had terrorized the Ozarks after the Civil War resulted in the publication of a well-received book called The Baldknobbers. Then, only a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, Lucile was having coffee with a group of news people, and managing editor George Olds, who was short of staff because of the war, asked her if she'd come back to work. And she said she couldn't. She just couldn't come back to work. And he said, "Well, is there something you could do?" And he said, "Well, I might write a column." And the result was The Good Old Days, the newspaper column all about Ozarks history. She described it as an antidote to war. And The Good Old Days column looked back at the news 50 years before. It was part of the Sunday paper, like I said, for more than 40 years. And 20 of those years were after she retired. And it became a must-read for anyone who cared about Springfield history. It was written like a letter, Dear Auntie, from a young girl, talking about what was going on in the world and also in the Ozarks during 50 years before. But even as Lucile was producing what she called her antidote to war, a St. Louis woman, Virginia Irwin, was in the thick of it as a reporter for the Post-Dispatch. Thanks in part to the ground laid by Peggy Hull, Irwin was one of the first correspondents into Berlin during World War II. And this photo of her with the headline, "She got into Berlin," was featured in the Post on VE Day in 1945. Now, during those war years, Lucile also continued to write and speak about the need to save her 2 favorite preservation projects, the Wilson's Creek Civil War Battlefield and the Nathan Boone Home in Ash Grove. Both eventually were saved. Wilson's Creek is part of the National Park Service, and the Nathan Boone Home is a state historic site. And both of them are really worth a visit. They're really fun to go see. But meanwhile, the specter of war hung heavy over the lives of Lucile and her husband. Her brother George and her two stepsons were serving in the Pacific. When George came home unscathed, but one stepson was killed when the aircraft carrier Franklin was bombed, and the other spent the war in a Japanese prison camp. As you can imagine, the stress, especially on Lucile's husband, was terrible. So much so that not long after the war ended, he had a massive heart attack and died. They'd been married only 11 years. But, as you no doubt can imagine, before long, Lucile was back at the newsroom full-time. Now, not long after she rejoined the newspaper staff, the city desk began sending her on assignments with a woman named Betty Love, who was one of the newspaper's prized photographers. Like Lucile, Betty began as a school teacher. She majored in art at Drury College, and then moved to Texas and taught art in San Antonio for a few years. Then came back and joined the Springfield Public School System as a junior high art teacher. Also like Lucile, though, Betty got tired of teaching, and she applied for a summer job at Springfield newspapers. For about 3 years, she worked as an illustrator and cartoonist, and she's in the foreground here on the left. And then she talked management into letting her become a photographer. Much to their surprise, she was a huge success. Later, George Olds, the managing editor, wrote a rather backhanded column in praise of Betty. He said, "Girl reporters are not new in our experience. Everyone knows we have boasted some wonderful ones. We've always tried to hire the best possible people as individuals, not men or women. But somehow it never occurred to us to hire a girl photographer. In that sense, we were about as dumb as the editors who still won't hire women reporters." Well, over the next few years, Betty and her pictures became really well known. She was a charter member of the virtually all-male National Press Photographers Association and one of the first inductees into the Missouri Photojournalism Hall of Fame. She also became known for her take-no-prisoners attitude about her work. That's when she had a falling out with her friend President Harry Truman about Truman's pal, Federal Marshal Fred Canfield, and a picture that she wanted to take of a federal prisoner. Canfield told Betty that she couldn't take the picture. Then, when the reporter with Betty, who was not Lucile, pointed out that Betty had a constitutional right to take that picture, Canfield said, "The Constitution be damned," and he threw a blanket over the dead prisoner, and Betty took the picture. Well, that story made headlines across the country, and it reverberated through the journalism community, and it upset Harry Truman. Ultimately, it took Betty's and the president's mutual friend, the artist Thomas Hart Benton, to get them to make peace, and they both needed each other. When Truman came back to Missouri, he needed Betty to take his pictures, and of course, if he was there, Betty needed to take the pictures. But Benton talked Truman into not putting his hand over his face or not putting a hat over his face when Betty was around. Excuse me. And it didn't take long after Betty and Lucile began working together that the two became a hit with readers across the Ozarks. When they began working together, the two women were middle-aged. In 1950, Lucile was 52 and Betty was 40. And over the next 15 years, the two women covered a variety of stories, from bank robberies and murders to Ozark history and President Truman. As often as not, the stories about what it took for Betty and Lucile to get their story was at least as interesting as what appeared in the paper. One of their most well-known adventures had to do with the old Philibert Cemetery on the edge of the James River. Now, back in those days when Lucile and Betty were working together, one of the biggest political issues in this part of the country was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their insatiable thirst for building dams, especially in the Ozarks. And one of the most contentious of those projects was the building of Table Rock Lake, which was going to back up the bottomlands across the James and the White Rivers, including the little Philibert Cemetery. And when Lucile heard about the cemetery's plight, she wangled an assignment so that she and Betty could go there and do a story before it disappeared underwater. She knew that Joseph Philibert, a French fur trader, was probably the first white settler in that part of the Ozarks, and his burial place deserved attention. So on the appointed day, when they arrived at the edge of the James River across from the cemetery, the bridge had been washed out. Instead of making the long drive around, they decided to take the advice of a fisherman and wade across the river. Now, we'd have to wade through weeds, then go down a slippery mud bank to get to the shallow water, Lucile wrote in that Sunday's paper. But that's exactly what we did because Betty wanted to get her pictures. Well, Lucile was equally determined. So she took off her shoes, hiked up her skirt, and headed across. Betty, of course, took a picture of Lucile in the river, and then she took off her shoes, rolled up her pants legs, and she followed. The two were dripping wet as they took notes on and pictures of the 22 small graves. So when they made ready to step back into the river, they weren't really as enthusiastic as they had been on the other side. Then, as Lucile wrote, just like in the movies, when a rescue comes at the desperate moment, a boat came around the bend. They waved and called for help. And then, also just like in the movies, the young woman in the boat said, "Why, you're Betty Love, aren't you?" Turned out that Betty had taken the woman's picture several years before when she won a scholarship. And people always remembered Betty if they took her picture, if she took their picture. So they were saved. The two soggy newspaper women climbed in among a pile of camping gear, and their new friends ferried them across the river. Two fishermen helped them out on the riverbank, and then Betty took a picture of the couple in the boat, and you can see part of the story that appeared on Sunday. Their timing was excellent, because a few weeks later, the Corps of Engineers moved the cemetery to a much drier place in Kimberley City, and it's still there. It says Philibert Cemetery in an archway over the top. But every detail of that very damp day was described in Lucile's article on Sunday, complete with Betty's picture of Lucile knee-deep in the river. And the newspaper readers loved it. Another time, when Lucile and Betty were at a party, the city desk called to tracked them down and sent them to cover a bank robbery in Republic, a little town out west of Springfield. And later, a mutual friend who was at the party told me that as they left, Lucile said, "Well, we may get shot, but we're off." And as an aside, they always said, and I heard this from several people, that they were sent on crime stories and other iffy assignments because they were both single. And if something happened to them, then management wouldn't have a family to deal with. There wouldn't be nearly as much trouble. When they got to the Farmers State Bank in Republic, the police had everything under control. And the two actual robbers were in custody, and an extremely drunk getaway driver was handcuffed in the back seat of the police car. While Lucile was speaking with the police, Betty leaned into the car with her camera. And the would-be robber looked at her and gave her a big smile. He said, "Why, Betty, did you come to take my picture?" That's how well known they were. The other two bank robbers went to jail, but the fellow who recognized Betty had been so drunk that he couldn't even remember if he'd driven the car or not. And so they let him go free. Now, many more adventures of those two fearless female journalists followed. And then on January 1st, 1964, Lucile, age 65, retired from Springfield newspapers. When she retired, Lucile was so well known and had been around so long that the Sunday paper carried an editorial describing her as an editor's dream of a newspaper woman, a reporter who can do everything and anything and do it well. We are delighted that Lucile will continue her Sunday column, The Good Old Days. But, as I said earlier, even after her retirement and even with the column, Lucile just couldn't sit back. A few years after she left the paper, she was elected to a term on the Springfield City Council. And there she was a voice for historic preservation and worked to right some of the wrongs that she had learned about in her years as a reporter. And I think that she maybe got more attention on that day in the newspaper because she was an alum and they all knew her than otherwise. Excuse me. And in her later years, she was honored many times over by civic organizations, women's organizations, the College of the Ozarks, and she was even named the official Greene County historian. As near as I can tell, she's the only person that ever had that title. And she also spent a lot of time in later years offering advice to young women. And basically, she told them the same thing that she had written in her column in Denver. She told younger women they could do anything they wanted to. Her attitude and her advice was that women should and could make their own success. She certainly did. And so did Betty Love. And Peggy Hull and Frances Wayne and Elizabeth Gregory and Virginia Irwin and the rest of those fearless female journalists that Lucile met and worked with along the way. What a journey. And as she said over and over, she loved being a newspaper woman. And what a gift it has been for the rest of us who came afterward. I want to thank you.